Hello, Jonah.
Hello, Andrew. How are you?
I'm doing well this morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing quite well myself.
Oh, that's good. It's really a nice day. So glad we get to have this. Thank you for joining us. It's really such an honor to have you. So you are a composer at Juilliard, right?
Yes, I studied composition here in
Wow.
undergrad.
So what is that really, composition?
Well, that's a very good question. So I studied classical composition, which means I work within the medium of classical music. And basically what I do for my degree and what I do as as an artist is I create sounds and organize them, basically. I think that's sort of what the definition of music is, like organized sound. I'm not sure who originally said that, but basically what I try to do is just, there are so many sounds out there, I just try to put them together in a compelling way to create some sort of, overarching narrative or overarching journey in the larger scale of the piece. So yeah, that's a rough way of describing what the composer does.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So you have this sound, but do you ever make kind of disorganized sound where it's just like kind of up to whatever happens to be happening at that moment, and then it's still part of your music, and it's random, but it's still music?
Well, sometimes I'll write music that is designed to seem like that, like music that is intentionally conceived to seem like all over the place or like sort of arbitrary and random. Usually for me, that process is still very much thought out and sort of conceived in the process of writing the piece. It's not just like, hey, violinist, just kind of do whatever you want for 5 minutes. Like usually I'll put some directive in the score, but there are absolutely times where I want that sort of affect of, it seems like everything's unpredictable, everything's random. I know a lot of other composers though, they like to leave things a lot more up to the performers in their notation of the score. So a lot of composers do leave a lot of the freedom to the people who are playing it, and that can be really interesting. For me, myself, I usually tend to, notate everything pretty specifically in the score, at least up to this point. But
the score, like it's not a game though. What's that?
Well, the score is basically the sheet music that contains all of the parts of a given piece. So let's say I'm writing a piece for, 2 violins, a violin, cello. The score would have all of their parts stacked on top of each other. So it shows how the music sounds as a whole. Whereas the individual part is just one instrumental part. So there would be a violin part, there would be a viola part, there would be a cello part.
Oh, yeah. That's very interesting. Now, it's kind of like Mozart or Beethoven, but why should modern composers, are they trying to improve Mozart or Beethoven? Is there anything wrong with those composers? What are they doing now? Hasn't that already been done before?
Well, I think the most productive way of thinking about composition is not trying to one up the classical masters, because they are amazing. I mean, Beethoven and Mozart, as you mentioned, their music still endures today. It still gets played, hundreds of times a day all around the world. So, so I think at least what I'm trying to do, I can't speak for everyone, but sort of just create music that sort of has a greater relevance to the times that we live in, and sort of trying to, just do something different, not necessarily compete with them. Just create music that's more suited for, the times we live in today, the events we're experiencing, the emotions we feel. So yeah, I wouldn't say sometimes composers do have a rivalry with classical masters, and they're like, oh, Mozart was 12 when he did this, and I'm 15, but that's really, I think it's just fun games in general. I think mainly what we're trying to do is not to compete with them, because we all really look up to them a lot, and we learn so much from them and studying music. I think it's more just trying to do something different, that's maybe more relevant, or, well, I guess a better way of putting it would be relevant in a different way to the times that we live in now. if that answers.
Yes, exactly. It does answer my question. But actually, the great thing about these kinds of interviews and about science and about question and answer in general is that the answer to one question brings up another 10. So unfortunately, I have more questions for you.
That's
Like,
not unfortunate at all.
For example, you said that music that composers are writing now are more relatable to now. Why? What's happening now that wasn't happening before, and how can sound, organized or partially organized sound, depict this kind of these happenings that are happening now instead of in the 17 and 1800s?
That's a very good question. I think a lot of it has to do. Of course, there's all sorts of like music that's designed to be like a political critique, or there's music that's designed to reflect a social event or something like that. But I think even if you're writing something that's called absolute music, or quote unquote absolute music, which is basically music that has no real extra musical influence, it's just music for the sake of music, like a sonata in G flat major, just for solo piano, there's no like inspiration. I think even with that music, it's very important to remember the context in which the composer wrote it, in terms of like geography, timeline, social and political events of the time. So I think even if we're not consciously trying to reflect the times in our music, honestly, I think they seep their way in anyway. Because there's this little myth about like the composer living in their like cave, just scrawling out music for 12 hours a day and never leaving. But I think really in actuality, it's impossible to live in a vacuum like that. I think even if you're more secluded, you still experience life as it is. You still go throughout your day and experience what's different about the world and what's changed about it and what's good about it and what's bad about it. And I think that sort of just finds its way into the music of our time, even if it's like quote unquote absolute music, because it's still absolute music that's being written at a particular time, at a particular place, by a particular person of a particular identity. So you have all these factors that contribute to, music not just being, like nameless piece in G flat, which could have been written 100 years ago or 100 years from now. I think, at all points in history, especially now, even absolute music does sort of have a relevance to our times, just because the composer is a member of society. I know that's a little bit vague, but that's kind of how I think that.
And so is it necessary? Is it important for the listener, whoever's listening to the music, to know when and why the composer might have written the piece? Or if they just listen to the music because, they like the way it sounds and they find a completely new meaning for it. Like, for example, let's say they listen to a piece called Don Quixote by Richard Strauss, and it's a great piece and it's long, and they think instead of some miller or some nice old man, history professor, whoever they want to think of when they think of Don Quixote, they think of Superman, and they get the story completely wrong, but they still enjoy it and it still works and it still fits the music. Is that okay, or is that very bad to go against what the composer meant?
It's also a good question. I don't think or at least I think for me, I don't think interpreting music in a different way is going against what the composer meant. I think going against the composer meant is like, more like if you have something in the score and you like recklessly don't follow it or something like that. Or if you have stuff that the composer really specified, I want it to be this way, I want it to be that way, in the performance of the music, I think that's probably more like kind of against what the composer meant. But, once the music is played, once we hear it, the composer is, they can't change that anymore. Like it's happened, and now it's up to the audience to really internalize it and come to some conclusion about its value or its effect on them. So I think I don't like to play into the idea that there's like one interpretation you can have of a piece. I mean, that's why you get so many different opinions of music. Like you have people who love this piece and people who like, oh my God, I can't listen to it. I think that's sort of the beauty of music, along with many other art forms, is that it is so subjective, you know? Every person can have a completely different interpretation of it, and that's totally okay. They're all valid. It's just, you know, it's organized sound, and it's really up to us to fully come to the conclusion of, oh, what does this mean to me? What is it saying to me? You know, why is this important? So I think the composer can do a lot through their art to sort of like encourage an audience member to go down a certain path or to like start thinking about certain things. But really, I think it's really important to realize that it's totally okay to have different interpretations of a piece, and it's honestly it's what makes the classical music world so interesting, I think.
So it seems like people listen to more modern music. People write modern music because it's more relevant to now, and it more closely details how things are going on right now. And that's different from what things were going on 100 years ago, and that's different from the things that will be going on 100 years from now. And people listen to what is modern music because they want to better understand this person's interpretation of the person who wrote its interpretation of how things are going right now. And maybe they disagree, maybe they agree, but it helps cope with what's happening in a good way or a bad way, and it helps them better understand and more deeply appreciate the modern state of the world. Would you say that that's true?
I would say that that's definitely a large part of at least why I write music.
Oh, yeah. What about the other small
part? Well, I also, I just find music to be, a lot of people will say the phrase, music is a universal language. And to some degree, I think that's true. But it's not like you can like usually communicate like through music with no text, like what you need to pick up at the grocery store or anything like that. Like, it's not like you can play a Mahler symphony and the audience will be like, oh, Mahler really wanted a carton of milk and like a dozen eggs or something like that. Like you can't really communicate things that concretely, unless you have obviously like someone who's like speaking or something like that. But I think, anyway, I'm rambling, sorry. But I think music does have a very unique power in that, first of all, there's no prerequisite to listening to it. You can certainly deepen your understanding of music by studying it, by being exposed to it more often, all of these things. But anyone, with the capability to hear can listen to any sort of music without any, prior intervention or anything like that. So anyone can really enter this world of the music with no prerequisites. And also I feel that it does have a unique power in that it encourages, an audience to join you in this world that sort of you've put together. And often it can be, as I'm sure you know, it can be a profoundly emotional experience. It can be a profoundly upsetting experience. It can be a profoundly, confusing experience. And I think that's really powerful. I think one of the most powerful things that music does is cause the audience to ask questions or cause the audience to have some increased curiosity about something. So, I think in that way there's so much that music can communicate. And then the other thing is that it's really a shared experience. I think it creates such a strong connection and sort of bond between audience members that I think is really special and something that composers try to take advantage of. So anyway, sorry for all the ramblings.
No, thank you for all the ramblings. It was very helpful. I agree about your anecdote about live music. Really, I think that the sounds that come from instruments are only played that way one time and will have never played that way and will never be played that way in that same way again. I think that music produced through a speaker, like, the one up there, is nice, but it's different. It's through a speaker. Instead of the air wiggling like that, actually it wiggles like that. Because that's what sound is. It's wiggly air. And so the air wiggles differently when you play it through a speaker than through an instrument. And so that's why recorded music sounds different from from live music. And so I really think that composers wrote this, so the composer meant this music to be interpreted by real instruments. They didn't mean it to be interpreted by a speaker. They meant it with acoustic live instruments. So that's why I think that music can be more closely interpreted with live instruments, but it can be pretty closely interpreted with speakers. So really, this brings us to one last question, if you will. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Whether it's through a speaker, or whether it's through a piano, or a violin, or a nice somber guitar, all that they produce is, all they do is wiggly air. It's just sound, nothing but E flats and F sharps, or me flats and fa sharps, as we say at the Juilliard School. So why create a meaning to it? Is there any meaning? I mean, it's just sound. Sound is sound. Is this all constructed? Is this all like completely in our imaginations? Just all this hypothetical meaning and interpretation to it? Or is it just sound? Or is there really something more there in its core?
Well, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this after I go with my spiel, too, because I think this question can be interpreted in so many different ways. But you're right. It is just like a symphony, a Mahler symphony. Even though it might be an hour and a half long and might have been written over 4 years, and it's like this thing that we envision as this pinnacle of art, of music. It is just an hour and a half of like wiggly air. It is. I mean, there might be a lot of people playing it, and there might be a lot of people listening to it, but that's basically what it is. But I think, through the centuries of our experience of music, and also just our nature, I think humans attribute meaning and emotion in really interesting ways. And we're not really objective creatures in a lot of ways. Like, that's why you have differing of opinion, differing of emotion, different of personality, even. We could take everything at the surface and be like, oh, why should I be spending my time listening to this Mahler symphony if it's just wiggly air? I could just, go listen to the cars beep, and that's the same thing.
Yes,
yeah, exactly. But I think we do attribute emotion and attribute, meaning and value to things that, obviously, many other creatures might do that in different ways. Like, I would be curious to ask a tortoise how they value and appreciate sound, or don't value and appreciate sound. But I think over the centuries of our continued exploration of music, we've sort of developed this, or almost like a frame of mind. I don't think that's quite the right word to describe it, but our ears have been trained, as it were, to experience sound in a different way, and through our education, when all of us, or whoever is involved in classical music, is educated. We learn to hear, like, oh, this dominant chord, it really sounds like it should go here, things like that. So I think it's really a combination between, I think it's like learned schemata and is it natural schemata? I don't know, which is basically like our frame of mind for perceiving music that's learned, meaning that we developed over years and centuries, or our perception of music that is just natural to us as, you know, living creatures. So that was a really, I don't know, unhinged answer. But I think it, I mean, in a certain sense, it sounds pessimistic to say that it's just wavy air. But in another sense, I think it's profoundly encouraging because, you know, what an amazing thing it is that we can hear something like that. We can take in sounds and we can have this transcendent, transformative experience from it. What a fantastic part of our experience that is, you know?
Yeah.
So, what do you think, though? I'm curious.
What do I think?
Yeah.
I think that there's some music that is natural. I said the natural schemata. I think that in nature, there's this thing called the overtone series. Don't worry too much about it, but basically, there are some natural pitches. I'll go on the piano, a little out of frame, but that's okay. And it goes like, let's see if I can get the pedal. In nature, you hear these pitches. And those are actually not made by humans. I mean, I just played them on the piano, but those are actually just already they were there before humans came to the earth, and they'll be there after humans die from the earth. And they're after humans, you know, go off, you know, after they become extinct. Those are just natural. That's a natural pattern of sounds. It can happen on any note, like it can happen on this note, you know. It can happen on that note. It can happen on any, and it's just a pattern, and it's called the overtone series. And so when you play a major chord, what our ears sound as nice, it sounds like this. And that's actually the notes of the overtone series. So when you play it, it sounds nice to our ears because it's actually natural. So I think that isn't, but does that have any meaning? I think that it has meaning to why it sounds nice. But I, as a person, don't think it has meaning as to what it is. I think that it's only sound, but I think that it means what it is. It means that it was played. Maybe it means that it was just there in the first place. But it doesn't mean this camera, or you, or your computer. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean my shoe, or Jonah's head. It just means the air that it is. And the pattern means that it was not made by humans. The pattern was already there, but I think that the air is the same. It still means the physics of what it is. And I think that if you were to say that it actually represents Jonah going out to the store to buy his groceries on Monday afternoon, I think that that is a construct. I think that that's perfectly okay, and that exists in here, in the head. But I think that that meaning was placed on there, externally. And that's okay. You can do that, certainly. But I think that that meaning is not natural, and it doesn't have to be. But that's a human meaning, and that's okay. So I think that the physics of the sound are natural meaning, and the interpretive program or story is unnatural meaning, which is okay. So would you agree, or do you have a slightly different opinion, which is perfectly okay?
Yeah,
Yes.
Well, I totally mostly agree with what you're saying, and yeah, it is very interesting to note that, like, all this stuff that, obviously we've taken it to an extent that is not, what occurs in nature, but everything does, and especially, in Western classical music, it does stem from, this sort of omnipresent overtone series, which is, found all over the place in nature. And as you said, it far predates us, and it will continue to be present, forever. But yeah, I also really agree with you in terms of meaning being, saying the word unnatural just seems to have, like, sort of a negative spin on it. I think it is natural in that, we are experiencing it naturally, and it's something that we perceive as we're listening to it. It's not something that it's not that we listen to music and are just like, oh, I really want to believe that this is this. I really want to believe that this F sharp major chord means that I'm going to the grocery store and getting a carton of milk. I think most of the time, and I think for me the most meaningful experiencing of music is when we just listen to something and, sort of a meaning is conjured up by our brain and by our being, without us even really, trying to analyze it and be like, oh, this goes here, oh, the dominant goes to the deceptive cadence, blah, 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 blah. I think it is natural in that we experience it and come to terms with it in sort of a kind of a natural way. I think it's a different type of, I think it's totally different than, because, yeah, well, like you said, it's a lot of it is determined by us, and a lot of the meaning is up to us. But I don't know. I don't necessarily consider that to be less natural. Maybe it's because it's still something that it's something that we naturally create. We do it without trying. It just happens. Like, I think we can't help experience things and then attribute them to something else. Our brains are constantly making connections. It's who we are. That's sort of how, like, the neuron system works.
And that's nature.
Yeah, it is, because we're natural creatures. So it's just a different, it's almost like a different side of the same coin. And like we talked about with learned schemata, it can definitely affect how those meanings are actually developed by us. If you play an F sharp major chord and say, like, another culture across the world, it might mean something completely different. And they have, they often have completely different tuning systems and completely different, definitions of affect and things like that. But it is still, natural meaning, because people still perceive it and they still attribute some sort of emotion or connection to it.
Through the natural firing of their neurons.
Yeah, exactly. So that's another thing that is like a uniting force about classical music, is that everyone, whether they like the piece or not, they experience it and they attribute meaning to it, and that's something that we can all do together. It doesn't, it's not like, even if some people might not like the piece and some people do, everyone has the ability to, be immersed in that world. So I think that's, sort of a nice egalitarian way of, looking at music. But yeah, I mostly totally agree with what you're saying. I just, maybe, I think it might be a little bit more productive to, I think the term unnatural, for better or for worse, it has, like, sort of a, a negative connotation, at least to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's the only thing I would point out. But yeah, I think you're very wise in saying what you did. I think
You are very wise in saying what you did. Thank you very much. It was very, very nice to hear what you had to say, and very helpful, very informative. You're a very wise man, and so it's very nice to learn from you and to see your interpretation. So thank you, and maybe we get to hear one of your pieces. Or would you like to send in a recording to be put on this?
Sure, yeah, why not?
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
I'd be happy to.
So thank you, Jonah. So we're gonna hear a nice piece by our modern composer, Jonah, and you can interpret it how you will, and however you wish to interpret it, to like it or to not like it, to have meaning or to not have meaning, to have a story or just to be wiggly air, that's perfectly fine, and we hope you experience the music all the same. Thank you very much for teaching us, Jonah, for making us learn. And
it was a pleasure to talk.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing your music and experiencing it in a true way. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.